He didn't take the bet for money. Didn't take it for glory or recognition or to prove anything to the whiskey-soaked miners in Silver Creek's only saloon. Hank Bigfoot Hunter took the bet for one simple reason. Everyone said it couldn't be done. When the stranger rode into town claiming he'd pay $500 to any man who could bring back proof of the creature they called Sasquatch, everything started to change. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. The stranger didn't stay. He left. And soon the joke wasn't funny anymore. Not to Hank. Not when his entire world depended on hunting something that might not even exist. Before we dive deeper into this twisted tale, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. The stranger couldn't even finish describing the creature before Billy Thompson started laughing. It started as a chuckle from the grizzled prospector, before rippling out like wildfire through the gathered crowd at the Golden Cup Saloon. Some of them had to cover their mouths to keep from choking on their whiskey. Others didn't bother. After all, wasn't that the point? Hank didn't flinch. He stood at the bar, fingers wrapped tight around his glass of rye. Eyes set on the stranger like the rest of them didn't exist. Like the laughter wasn't echoing across the saloon's sawdust floor, like he hadn't noticed the bartender's mouth twisting in discomfort when the man had mentioned creatures 8 feet tall. The stranger's name was Jeremiah Blackwood. He wore a coat too fine for Nevada territory, carried a rifle that cost more than most men made in a year, and spoke with the precise diction of someone who'd learned his words from books instead of campfires. His boots were polished leather, his hat was beaver felt, and his eyes held the kind of desperate madness that comes from seeing something the rest of the world refuses to believe. $500, Blackwood repeated, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. To any man who can bring me conclusive proof that the creature exists. Photographs, physical evidence, or the creature itself. Billy Thompson wiped tears from his eyes. You hear that, boys? City man wants to pay us for hunting fairy tales. The crowd erupted in fresh laughter. Someone shouted about hunting unicorns next. Another man suggested they charge extra for leprechauns. But Hank Bigfoot Hunter didn't laugh. He'd earned his nickname 3 years ago when he'd started telling anyone who'd listen about the thing he'd seen in the mountains north of town. The thing that left footprints bigger than a man's head and moved through the forest like smoke. Most folks figured the name was a joke, like calling a bald man Curly or a short man Stretch. They called him Hank Bigfoot Hunter because they thought he was crazy enough to believe in monsters. They weren't wrong about him being crazy. They were just wrong about why. Blackwood's eyes swept the room and landed on Hank. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the smoke-filled space. Blackwood saw something in Hank's face that made him step forward, spurs jangling on the wooden floor. You, he said, pointing a gloved finger at Hank. You've seen it. The laughter died like a candle in the wind. Hank set his glass down carefully. Might have. Describe it. Hank looked around the room at faces suddenly gone serious. Billy Thompson's grin had faded. The bartender had stopped wiping glasses. Even the saloon girls had paused in their work to listen. Big, Hank said finally. Bigger than any man has a right to be. Covered in dark hair, thick as a winter coat. Walks upright but moves wrong, like it's carrying too much weight in its shoulders and arms. He paused, remembering. Eyes like a wolf's, but older. Smarter. And when it looks at you, you know it's deciding whether you're worth killing. Blackwood nodded slowly. Where? Canyon country, about 30 miles north. There's old mine workings up there, abandoned camps, caves that go back farther than any man's explored. Hank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It's got territory marked out, same as a mountain lion. And it doesn't like visitors. Will you take me there? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Hank studied Blackwood's face, taking in the expensive clothes and soft hands, the rifle that had probably never been fired in anger and the boots that had never walked more than a mile from a railroad station. You'll die up there, Hank said matter-of-factly. Blackwood smiled, and for the first time since he'd walked into the saloon, he looked genuinely amused. Mr. Kolsky. But everybody calls me Hank Bigfoot Hunter. Mr. Bigfoot Hunter, I've been tracking this creature for 2 years across 4 territories. I've survived blizzards in Colorado, flash floods in Utah, and encounters with hostile Indians in Montana. I'm not afraid of dying in the Nevada mountains. Hank finished his whiskey and set the empty glass on the bar. Then you haven't been paying attention. That night, Hank sat on the porch of his cabin on the outskirts of town and stared up at the mountains. They rose like black teeth against the star-filled sky, jagged peaks that caught moonlight and threw it back in silver fragments. Somewhere up there, in the twisted canyons and hidden valleys, the creature was hunting. Or sleeping. Or watching him the way he was watching the mountains. He'd built the cabin himself after the army discharged him following the Battle of Little Bighorn. Not because he'd been wounded. Hank had walked away from that massacre with nothing more than a bullet graze on his left arm and memories that woke him up screaming 3 nights out of every week. The army had discharged him because he'd started talking about the things he'd seen in the wilderness between battles. Things that couldn't exist, according to his commanding officers. Things that made them question his sanity and fitness for service. Things with footprints the size of dinner plates. Hank had tried to tell them about the creature he'd encountered while scouting ahead of the main column near the Yellowstone River. How it had watched him from a ridge line for the better part of an hour, studying him with intelligent eyes before disappearing into the timber without making a sound. How he'd climbed up to where it had been standing and found impressions in the soft earth that were too big to belong to any known animal and too human in shape to dismiss as bare tracks. But the army wasn't interested in his stories. They were interested in winning a war against the Sioux, and soldiers who saw monsters weren't useful for that kind of work. So they'd given him his discharge papers and a one-way ticket to anywhere west of the Mississippi. He'd chosen Nevada territory because it was empty. Because a man could disappear into the mountains and not be found unless he wanted to be. Because there were stories here, whispered around mining camps and trading posts, about things that lived in the high country where the snow never completely melted and the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. Stories about Sasquatch. The next morning, Blackwood found Hank at his cabin. The city man rode a black gelding that probably cost more than most folks made in a year, and he'd added a pack horse loaded with enough supplies for a month in the wilderness. His rifle was a custom-made Sharps .50 caliber, the kind of weapon that could drop a buffalo at 800 yards. Everything about him screamed money and preparation and the kind of confidence that came from having the best equipment money could buy. "I assume you've reconsidered my offer," Blackwood said, not bothering to dismount. Hank looked up from where he was repairing a bridle. "Which part? The part where I lead you up into the mountains to get yourself killed, or the part where I split $500 with your widow? The part where you help me find the creature and claim your share of the reward?" Hank set down his leather working tools and studied Blackwood's face. There was something desperate there beneath the confidence, something that reminded him of men he'd known during the war who'd volunteered for suicide missions because staying in camp was worse than dying. "Why? Angus, what's this creature to you?" Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Then he dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. Up close, Hank could see that the man's expensive clothes couldn't hide the weight he'd lost or the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. 3 years ago, Blackwood said finally, my brother Samuel was part of a geological survey team working in the Cascade Mountains. 12 men went up to map mineral deposits and study rock formations. Only 3 came back. He paused, staring at the mountains. The survivors all told the same story. Something attacked their camp in the middle of the night. Something that walked like a man but was bigger and stronger than any man had a right to be. They said it killed 9 men with its bare hands before disappearing back into the forest. Could have been Indians, Hank said. Could have been a bear. Could have been claim jumpers looking to steal whatever they'd found up there. Could have been, Blackwood agreed. Except for the footprints they found the next morning. Except for the way the bodies were. He swallowed hard. The way they were torn apart. And except for the fact that Samuel wasn't among the dead. Hank felt something cold settle in his stomach. What do you mean? I mean they never found his body. The thing took him. Blackwood's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This came to my address in San Francisco 6 months ago. It's Samuel's handwriting. Hank unfolded the paper and read the single line written in a shaky scrawl. It keeps us alive. Help me. The paper felt heavier than it should have in Hank's hands. He read the line again, then looked up at Blackwood. This could be a hoax. Someone trying to get money out of you. It could be, Blackwood said. But it's not. I know my brother's handwriting, and I know he's alive up there somewhere. Being held by that creature for reasons I can't even imagine. His eyes met Hank's. I'm going to find him, Mr. Kowalski. With your help or without it. But I'd rather have someone along who knows the country and has actually seen what we're hunting. Hank folded the paper and handed it back. $500? $500. Plus supplies and equipment. Plus expenses for your time. And if we find your brother? Then I'll double it. Hank looked out at the mountains again. Somewhere up there, in the twisted canyons and hidden valleys, something was waiting. Something that had killed 9 men and taken a 10th for reasons no sane person could understand. Something that left footprints in stone and moved through the wilderness like it owned everything it surveyed. We leave at first light, Hank said. They rode north through country that got rougher and more isolated with every mile. The trail started as a decent wagon road that connected Silver Creek to the mining camps in the foothills, but it quickly deteriorated into a narrow track that switchbacked up steep slopes and crossed creek beds on wooden bridges that looked like they'd collapse if you breathed on them wrong. Blackwood rode well for a city man, keeping up with Hank's steady pace and not complaining when the trail got rocky or the grade got steep. His black gelding was sure-footed and strong, and his pack horse carried enough supplies to keep them fed and equipped for a month in the wilderness. But Hank could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line, the way his right hand never strayed far from his rifle. By noon they'd climbed high enough that the air was thin and cold, and the ponderosa pines had given way to stands of aspen and fir. The mountains stretched out around them in every direction, peak after peak receding into blue distance. It was beautiful country, but it was also dangerous country. The kind of place where a man could disappear and never be found, where the weather could turn deadly without warning, where things lived that didn't appear in any naturalist's guide. They stopped to rest the horses beside a creek that tumbled down from the high country in a series of small waterfalls. The water was clear and cold, tasting of snow and granite. Blackwood dismounted and knelt beside the stream to fill his canteen, while Hank studied the ground around the water's edge. Tracks, he said, pointing to a muddy patch beside a fallen log. Blackwood looked where he was pointing and saw the clear impression of a boot heel in the soft earth. Human. Recent. Maybe 2 days old. Hank knelt and studied the print more carefully. Size 11 or 12. Worn down heel on the right side. Man walking slow, not in any hurry. Prospector? Maybe. Or maybe someone else looking for the same thing we are. They followed the creek upstream for another hour before Hank called a halt. The trail had petered out completely, leaving them to pick their way between boulders and fallen trees. The forest was quiet except for the sound of running water and the occasional call of a jay or woodpecker. Too quiet, Hank thought. In country like this, there should be squirrels chattering and chipmunks scurrying through the undergrowth. The silence felt unnatural. We'll make camp here, he announced, pointing to a small clearing protected by a circle of granite boulders. Good shelter, fresh water, and we can see anyone approaching from 3 directions. It's barely 3 o'clock, Blackwood protested. This isn't city travel, Mr. Blackwood. Up here, you make camp while you've got daylight and good ground. Come nightfall, you want to be somewhere defensible with your back to something solid. They unsaddled the horses and set up their camp with the efficiency of men who'd done this kind of work before. Hank strung a rope corral for the animals while Blackwood cleared a fire circle and gathered dry wood. By sunset they had a small, nearly smokeless fire burning and coffee brewing in a battered pot. Tell me about the first time you saw it, Blackwood said as they ate a supper of bacon and hardtack. Hank stared into the fire and remembered. 3 years ago. I was hunting elk up in the high meadows, maybe 15 miles from here. Good country for it, lots of grass, water, and the animals come down from the peaks to feed before winter sets in hard. He paused to sip his coffee, feeling the bitter liquid burn away the taste of memory. I'd been tracking a big bull for most of the day, following sign through some of the roughest country you've ever seen. Finally caught up with him just before dark in a clearing beside a beaver pond. Had a clear shot, maybe 60 yards. Was just raising my rifle when I heard something behind me. The creature? Not heard it so much as felt it. You know how it is when someone's watching you? How the hair on the back of your neck stands up. It was like that, only stronger. Like having someone press a cold hand against your spine. Hank set down his coffee cup and continued. I turned around real slow and there it was. Standing maybe 30 feet away at the edge of the tree line. Biggest damn thing I've ever seen that walked on 2 legs. Had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more. Covered in dark hair from head to foot, thick as a bear's coat but longer. Arms that hung down past its knees. Shoulders wide as an axe handle. What did you do? Nothing. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Just stood there staring at this thing while it stared back at me. Must have been 5 minutes, maybe 10. Felt like an hour. And then it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next second I was looking at empty forest. Didn't hear it leave, didn't see it move. It just wasn't there anymore. Blackwood leaned forward. But you found tracks? Hank nodded. Clear as day in the soft mud beside the pond. Footprints 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. 5 toes, just like a human foot but bigger than any human foot has a right to be. He looked up at Blackwood. That's when I knew I wasn't crazy. When I knew what I'd seen was real. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. A coyote yipped and was answered by others, the calls echoing off the canyon walls. The fire crackled and settled, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. How do you plan to catch it? Hank asked finally. Blackwood patted the stock of his rifle. Same way you catch anything dangerous. You track it, corner it, and put it down before it can hurt you. And your brother? I'll find him first. The creature second. Hank shook his head. You're thinking about this wrong, Mr. Blackwood. This isn't some dumb animal you can corner and shoot. It's smart. Smarter than us, maybe. It's been living in these mountains for God knows how long, and it knows every rock and tree and hiding place. We're the ones who'll be cornered if we're not careful. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Then what do you suggest? We find its territory first. Learn its habits, its patterns, where it hunts and where it sleeps. We figure out what it wants and why it took your brother. And then maybe, if we're very lucky and very careful, we find a way to get him back without getting ourselves killed in the process. That could take months. Could take years, Hank agreed. Or it could take days if we get lucky. But rushing up here with guns blazing is just going to get us both killed, and your brother will still be wherever that thing is keeping him. Blackwood stared into the fire for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, less certain. What if he's already dead? What if that message was the creature's way of luring me up here? Then we'll find out, Hank said simply. But until we know for sure, we assume he's alive and we do everything we can to keep it that way. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass and ice forming at the edges of the creek. They broke camp early and rode deeper into the mountains, following game trails and old mining roads that led toward the heart of the high country. The landscape grew stranger as they climbed. The trees were twisted and gnarled, shaped by wind and weather into forms that looked almost human in the morning mist. Rocks balanced precariously on narrow pedestals, as if placed there by some giant hand. And everywhere there were caves, dark openings in the cliff faces that seemed to watch them as they passed. Used to be silver mines up here, Hank explained as they rode past the ruins of an old camp. Before the veins played out and the miners moved on to easier pickings. Most of these workings are abandoned now, but some of them go back hundreds of feet into the mountain. Good place to hide something, Blackwood observed. Or someone. They spent the morning exploring the old mining claims, looking for signs of recent activity. Most of the camps were clearly abandoned, with collapsed buildings and equipment too heavy to haul out rusting in the weather. But at the third site they investigated, Hank found something interesting. Footprints, he said, kneeling beside a muddy patch near what had once been the mine's entrance. Same size as the ones we found yesterday, but these are fresher. Maybe a day old. Blackwood dismounted and studied the tracks. There were several sets, all heading into the forest toward the higher peaks. More than one person? Looks like it. 3, maybe 4 different sets of boots. Hank stood and brushed dirt off his knees. And something else. He led Blackwood to the edge of the clearing where the forest began. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a single footprint that made both men stop and stare. It was huge, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions that looked disturbingly human. But the depth of the impression suggested something that weighed far more than any human, and the length of stride indicated something with legs much longer than those of any man. "Jesus," Blackwood whispered. "It was here," Hank said unnecessarily. "Recently. And it wasn't alone." They followed the mixed trail for another 2 hours, climbing steadily through country that grew more rugged and isolated with every step. The trees pressed closer on either side, their branches interlacing overhead to create a green tunnel that shut out most of the sky. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of pine resin and decomposing leaves. The trail led them to a box canyon with sheer walls rising 300 feet on 3 sides. At the far end, partially hidden by a screen of aspens, was the mouth of a cave. Not a natural cave, Hank realized as they got closer, but an old mine shaft that had been carved into the living rock by men with picks and dynamite and desperate hope. "This is it," he said softly. "This is where they're being kept." Blackwood checked his rifle and started forward, but Hank caught his arm. "Wait, look at the ground around the entrance. See how the grass is beaten down? How there are paths worn into the earth leading in different directions. This place has been used recently and regularly. We go charging in there and we might find ourselves trapped. Then what do you suggest?" Hank studied the canyon walls, looking for another way in or out. The rock faces were nearly vertical, but there were cracks and ledges that a determined climber might be able to use. And at the top of the eastern wall, partially hidden by scrub brush, was what looked like another cave opening. "There," he said, pointing up. "Secondary entrance, probably connected to the main shaft by old mining tunnels. If we can get up there, we might be able to get inside without being seen." "That's a hell of a climb. You got a better idea?" It took them the better part of 2 hours to work their way around the canyon rim and find a route down to the upper cave entrance. The climb was treacherous, with loose rock that threatened to start a landslide with every step. But eventually they reached the opening, a natural cavity in the cliff face that connected to the man-made tunnels beyond. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of stone and metal, and something else that made Hank's stomach clench. The smell of fear and human waste and despair. They made their way through the tunnels by the light of a single lantern, following passages that branched and rejoined in a maze that would have been easy to get lost in. The miners who'd carved these passages had been thorough, boring into the mountain from multiple directions in their search for silver ore. But it was the sounds that guided them deeper into the complex. Voices, human voices, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Men talking in low, frightened tones. And something else, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the rock around them like distant thunder. They extinguished the lantern and continued by feel, using the rough stone walls to guide them toward the voices. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and pale light filtered in from somewhere ahead. Natural light, as if there was an opening to the outside world. Hank edged forward and peered around a corner into the main cavern. What he saw there would stay with him for the rest of his life. The cavern was enormous, easily 100 feet across and half as high. Natural light streamed in from the main entrance, illuminating a scene that belonged in a nightmare. Along one wall, connected to the rock by heavy chains, were 7 men in various stages of physical and mental deterioration. Their clothes were torn and filthy, their hair and beards grown long and matted. Some sat staring at nothing with the vacant eyes of men whose minds had broken. Others rocked back and forth, muttering to themselves in voices too low to understand. But it was the creature that dominated the space. It sat near the center of the cavern on what looked like a throne carved from a single massive boulder. 8.5 feet tall even while seated, covered in dark fur that caught and reflected the light like black silk. Its face was a horrifying mixture of human and animal features. Intelligent eyes set above a flat, wide nose and a mouth full of teeth that were too large and too sharp. Its arms were impossibly long and powerfully muscled, ending in hands that were clearly capable of tearing a man in half. And it was watching the chained men with the patient attention of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. Hank felt Blackwood tense beside him and put a restraining hand on the man's shoulder. Charging in now would get them all killed. They needed a plan, needed to understand what they were dealing with before they acted. As they watched, one of the chained men, a thin fellow with graying hair and a torn shirt, began to speak. "Please," he said in a voice hoarse from disuse. "I've told you everything I know about the mining claims. The locations, the assay reports, the ownership documents. I don't know what else you want from me." The creature made that rumbling sound again, and Hank realized it was trying to speak. The words came out distorted and difficult to understand, filtered through vocal cords and a mouth that weren't designed for human language, but the meaning was clear enough. More men coming. More maps. More gold. Hank felt his blood run cold. The thing wasn't just keeping these men prisoner, it was using them to gather information. Information about mining claims and mineral deposits and the movements of prospectors and survey teams. It was systematically hunting and capturing humans for a purpose that went far beyond simple predation. Blackwood had recognized one of the chained men. Samuel Blackwood sat against the far wall, still alive but looking 10 years older than his actual age. His clothes were in rags, his face was covered with a scraggly beard, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd seen too much and given up hope of rescue. But he was alive. Hank pulled Blackwood back into the tunnel before the man could do something stupid. They retreated 100 feet from the chamber before Hank felt safe enough to whisper. "Now we know what we're dealing with," he said. "That thing is intelligent. It's organized. And it's using those men to gather information about human activities in the area." "Why?" Blackwood's voice was barely audible. "Territory. It's trying to understand human patterns so it can avoid areas where there are too many people and focus on areas where it can operate without being detected." Hank paused, thinking. Or maybe it's looking for something specific. Gold, silver, some kind of mineral deposit that it needs for its own purposes. What are its own purposes? I don't know. But I know we can't take that thing in a straight fight. It's too big, too strong, and it knows we're here. How can you be sure it knows? Because something that's smart doesn't survive in the wilderness without being aware of everything that happens in its territory. It probably knew we were coming before we left Silver Creek. They made their way back through the tunnels to the upper entrance, moving as quietly as possible. The climb back up to the canyon rim was even more treacherous in the fading afternoon light, but they managed it without starting a rock slide or breaking their necks. By the time they reached their horses, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They rode back to their previous night's camping spot in silence, both men lost in their own thoughts about what they'd seen and what it meant. "We need help," Blackwood said finally as they made camp. "More men, more weapons. Maybe dynamite to seal the cave." Hank shook his head. "That thing has 7 hostages, including your brother. You start a fight with explosives and you'll kill them all. Then what do you suggest? We study it, learn its patterns, its habits, when it leaves the cave and where it goes. Find its weaknesses." Hank poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. "And we figure out why it's keeping those men alive instead of just killing them outright." "You think there's a reason beyond gathering information?" "I think that creature is a lot smarter than either of us wants to admit. And I think it has plans that go far beyond catching prospectors and stealing their maps." They spent the next 3 days observing the canyon from concealed positions on the surrounding ridges. The creature followed a routine that was both predictable and revealing. It left the cave every morning just after dawn, always alone, and disappeared into the high country for hours at a time. It returned in late afternoon carrying game, deer, elk, sometimes smaller animals like rabbits or grouse. Enough food to feed itself and 7 human prisoners. But it was what happened during its absences that interested Hank most. The chained men were left alone but not unguarded. The creature had rigged some kind of alarm system using rocks balanced on wooden levers. Any attempt to escape or break the chains would send stones tumbling, creating noise that could be heard for miles in the thin mountain air. More importantly, the prisoners had organized themselves. Despite their chains and their circumstances, they worked together. One man kept watch while others tried to work their bonds loose. They shared food and water. They talked quietly to keep each other's spirits up. And they had developed some kind of plan, though Hank couldn't tell what it was from his distant observation post. Samuel, still the leader, Blackwood observed on the third day, watching through his field glasses as his brother directed the other men in some kind of organized activity. Even chained up in a cave, he's trying to find a way out. Good, Hank said. That means they haven't given up. And it means they might be able to help when we make our move. When do we make our move? Hank lowered his own glasses and looked at the sky. Storm clouds were building over the high peaks, dark and heavy with the promise of rain or snow. The weather was turning, and winter was coming to the mountains whether the calendar said it was ready or not. Soon, he said. Before that storm hits and we lose our chance. That night, Hank dreamed of the creature. In his dream, it wasn't a monster but a man. A tall, powerful man with intelligent eyes and hands that could create as easily as they could destroy. The man stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over a valley filled with smoke and fire and the sound of gunshots. Below him, other men, smaller men with pale skin and cruel faces, burned buildings and shot anything that moved. The man watched his world die, watched his people die, and made a decision. He turned away from the valley and walked into the mountains, into the high country where the snow never melted and the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. And there he waited and changed and planned his return. Hank woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth and the sound of distant gunfire echoing in his ears. Beside him, Blackwood slept restlessly, muttering names in his sleep that might have been his brother's. The storm hit 2 days later with a violence that reminded both men why the mountains were no place for civilized folks. The wind howled through the peaks like a living thing, driving snow horizontally through the air and creating whiteout conditions that made travel impossible. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and ice formed on everything that wasn't moving. They huddled in their camp, keeping the fire burning and the horses sheltered, waiting for the weather to break. But Hank knew the creature wouldn't wait. Storm or no storm, it would continue its routine, continue its plans, continue whatever purpose had driven it to capture and hold 7 human beings. On the second day of the storm, Hank made a decision. I'm going in, he told Blackwood. This weather gives us cover, but it also means that creature might change its routine. If it decides those prisoners are more trouble than they're worth. I'm going with you. No. You're going back to Silver Creek. If I don't come back in 3 days, you get the sheriff and as many armed men as you can find and come looking for me. Blackwood grabbed Hank's arm. That wasn't our deal. Our deal was that I'd help you find your brother. I found him. Now I'm going to get him out. Hank pulled free and started checking his weapons. But if this goes wrong, Samuel and those other men are going to need someone who can organize a rescue. Someone with money and connections and the ability to convince skeptical lawmen that monsters are real. You can't take that thing alone. I'm not going to fight it, Hank said. I'm going to outsmart it. He left before dawn, moving through the storm with the confidence of a man who'd learned to navigate in conditions that would kill most people. The snow was knee-deep and still falling, but Hank had grown up in Montana territory where winters made the Nevada mountains look like a mild inconvenience. It took him 4 hours to reach the canyon, and by the time he got there he was coated in ice and snow like some kind of Arctic scarecrow. But he was alive, and he had a plan. The creature's tracks were visible in the fresh snow, leading out of the canyon toward the high peaks just as they had every morning for the past week. But the storm had covered its trail, and even something with the creature's knowledge of the country would have trouble navigating in the wide-out conditions. Which meant Hank had time. He made his way to the upper cave entrance and descended into the tunnel system. This time he carried no light, navigating by touch and memory through passages he'd studied and memorized over the past 3 days. The air in the tunnels was warmer than the outside temperature, heated by the thermal mass of the surrounding rock and the body heat of the prisoners below. He reached the observation point overlooking the main cavern and carefully peered around the corner. The 7 prisoners were huddled together for warmth, sharing what little body heat their chains would allow. Samuel Blackwood sat with his back against the cavern wall, talking quietly to the others in a voice too low for Hank to make out the words. But the creature was gone, just as Hank had hoped. He made his way down into the main cavern, moving as quietly as possible across the uneven stone floor. The prisoners looked up as he approached, and Hank saw hope flicker in their eyes for the first time in months. "Who are you?" Samuel whispered. "Hank, Bigfoot Hunter. Your brother sent me." Hank knelt beside Samuel's chains and examined the heavy iron links. "How long have you got before that thing comes back?" "Hours, maybe less in this weather. It doesn't like to be caught out in storms." Samuel's voice was hoarse but steady. "These chains are secured with iron pins driven into the rock. You'll need tools to get us loose." Hank nodded and moved to the next prisoner, a grizzled prospector who looked like he hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. "What's your name, friend?" "Tom Bradley. Been here 4 months." The man's eyes were haunted but alert. "That thing, it's not just an animal. It talks. It plans. And it's got something big in mind for all of us." "What kind of something?" Bradley glanced at Samuel, who nodded. "It's been asking questions about the territory. Mining claims, town locations, how many people live where. It's mapping out human settlements like it's planning some kind of campaign." Hank felt ice form in his stomach. "Campaign against what?" "Against us," Samuel said quietly. "All of us. It thinks humans are invading its territory, and it's planning to do something about it." Hank studied the chains more carefully. The iron pins were driven deep into the rock, but the rock itself was softer than it looked. Limestone, probably, carved out by underground water over thousands of years. With the right tools and enough time, he might be able to chip them loose. But he didn't have the right tools, and time was running out. "Listen to me," he said to the 7 prisoners. "I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, you need to be ready to move fast. Those chains might be secured to the rock, but rock can be broken if you know how." He pulled a stick of dynamite from his coat pocket. Not enough to bring down the cavern, but enough to crack the limestone around the iron pins if placed correctly. Samuel's eyes widened. "You'll bring the whole mountain down on us." "Not if I do this right." Hank moved to the first chain anchor and began studying the rock formation around it. These limestone deposits have natural fracture lines. A small charge placed at the right angle should crack the rock without causing a major collapse. Should. Hank grinned grimly. "You got a better idea?" The blast echoed through the cavern like thunder, but the rock held. More importantly, the limestone around 3 of the iron pins cracked and split, allowing the prisoners to work their chains loose with desperate strength born of months in captivity. But the explosion had done more than free prisoners. It had announced their presence to everything within miles, including one very large, very angry creature that was probably already heading home through the storm. "Move," Hank ordered. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before company arrives." The freed prisoners helped the others work their chains loose while Hank rigged the remaining dynamite at strategic points around the cavern. Not to kill the creature, he wasn't sure anything could kill something that size and strength, but to bring down enough rock to seal the cave entrance and buy them time to escape. They were almost finished when they heard it. A roar that seemed to come from the mountain itself, echoing through the tunnel system like the voice of an angry god. The creature had returned, and it knew what they'd done. "Go," Hank shouted, pushing the weakest of the prisoners toward the upper tunnel entrance. "Get to the surface and don't look back." Samuel grabbed his arm. "What about you? Someone has to slow that thing down." The prisoners stumbled and crawled their way through the narrow passages toward daylight and freedom. Behind them, Hank could hear the creature moving through the main tunnels with impossible speed and grace, its roars of rage growing closer by the second. He reached the upper entrance just as the first of the freed men emerged into the storm. 7 scarecrow figures stumbled out into the blowing snow, squinting against the sudden brightness after months of cave darkness. And then the creature erupted from the tunnel behind them. Hank had never seen it this close, had never appreciated its sheer size and power until it filled the cave entrance like a force of nature made flesh. 8.5 feet of muscle and fury, moving with the fluid grace of something born to hunt and kill. Its eyes found Hank immediately, and in them he saw intelligence, rage, and something else that made his blood run cold. Recognition. It knew him, had been waiting for him. This entire confrontation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The creature spoke, its voice a rumbling bass note that seemed to vibrate through stone and bone alike. The words were distorted but understandable, shaped by a mouth not designed for human language but guided by an intelligence that refused to be limited by biology. As predicted, Hank raised his rifle, knowing it would be useless against something that size but needing to try anyway. Let them go. Your quarrel is with me. The creature tilted its massive head, studying him with eyes that held depths Hank couldn't fathom. No quarrel with you, Hunter. You? Useful. Useful for what? Instead of answering, the creature moved. Not toward Hank or the escaping prisoners, but toward the canyon wall. Its massive hands found purchase on rock faces that looked smooth and unclimbable, and it began to ascend with the fluid grace of something that had been climbing these mountains since before the first human had ever seen them. In seconds, it had reached the rim of the canyon. In seconds more, it had disappeared into the storm. Hank stood in the swirling snow, rifle still raised, trying to understand what had just happened. The creature could have killed him, could have killed all of them. Instead, it had let them go. Because he was useful. The thought sent ice through his veins colder than any mountain storm. The prisoners were in bad shape. Months of captivity and poor nutrition had left them weak and disoriented, barely able to walk in the deep snow. Hank knew they'd never make it back to civilization without help, and the storm was getting worse by the hour. But Samuel Blackwood proved he was made of tougher stuff than his appearance suggested. Despite his physical condition, he organized the other men into a survival group, pairing the stronger with the weaker, sharing what little warmth and energy they had among them. There's an old mining shack about 2 miles down the ridge, he told Hank. We used it as a supply cache during the survey. If it's still standing, we can shelter there until the storm passes. They made their way through the blizzard like a chain of ghosts, each man holding onto the one in front of him to keep from getting separated in the wide-out conditions. Hank took point, using his knowledge of the country and his instincts as a tracker to navigate through terrain that had become alien and deadly. The mining shack was still there, though barely. The roof had partially collapsed under previous snowfalls, and the walls were more gaps than timber. But it was shelter, and shelter was life in conditions like these. They huddled together in the least damaged corner of the structure, sharing body heat and the meager rations Hank had brought. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if the mountains themselves were angry at being disturbed. Tell me about the creature, Hank said to Samuel as they waited for the weather to break. What did it want from you? What was it planning? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the gaps in the walls where snow was beginning to drift through. It's not what we thought it was, he said finally. Not just some kind of large animal or primitive human. It's something else entirely. What do you mean? I mean, it has memories. Not just of its own life, but of things that happened before it was born. It talked about watching wagon trains cross the plains 50 years ago. About seeing the first prospectors come into these mountains. About the changes that have happened to the land and the animals. Tom Bradley nodded from where he sat wrapped in a torn blanket. It knows things no animal should know. About human nature, about how we think and plan and organize ourselves. Like it's been studying us. For how long? Generations, maybe. It talked about others like itself, scattered across the frontier. All of them watching, learning, waiting for something. Hank felt that familiar cold sensation in his stomach. Waiting for what? Samuel met his eyes. For us to become weak enough to push back. For our settlements to grow large enough to be worth taking. For the right moment to reclaim territory we've been stealing from them for decades. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it cleared, the rescued prisoners were weak but alive, and the mountain landscape had been transformed into a winter wonderland of impossible beauty and deadly treachery. Snow hung heavy on the pine boughs, and ice covered every exposed rock surface like nature's own armor plating. But they were alive, and they were free. The journey back to Silver Creek took another 2 days, moving slowly to accommodate the weakened prisoners. They followed game trails and old mining roads when possible, but much of the travel was cross-country through terrain that tested even Hank's considerable wilderness skills. Jeremiah Blackwood met them on the outskirts of town, having organized a rescue party that included the local doctor and several volunteers with medical training. The reunion between the brothers was emotional but brief. Samuel and the other prisoners needed immediate medical attention, and there would be time for talking later. But as the rescued men were being loaded into wagons for transport to the doctor's office, Samuel caught Hank's arm. "It let us go for a reason," he said urgently. "That creature didn't just give up after months of keeping us prisoner. It wanted us to escape." "Why?" "Because it wanted us to bring back word about what's up there. It wanted people to know that it exists, that it's intelligent, that it's not going anywhere." Samuel's grip tightened on Hank's arm. "This wasn't a rescue, Hank. This was a message." The celebration in Silver Creek lasted most of the night. 7 men who had been given up for dead had returned from the mountains with stories that would be told and retold for generations. The local newspaper sent a reporter from Carson City, and talk began of organizing proper expeditions to study and document the creature that Hank Bigfoot Hunter had been talking about for years. But Hank didn't celebrate. He sat on the porch of his cabin, staring up at the mountains and thinking about what Samuel had said. About creatures scattered across the frontier, watching and waiting. About messages and warnings and the possibility that what they'd accomplished in the cave had been exactly what their captor had intended all along. Jeremiah Blackwood found him there just after midnight, nursing a bottle of whiskey and looking like a man who'd seen too much. "Samuel's going to be fine," Blackwood reported. "Doctor says he's malnourished and exhausted, but he'll recover. They all will, given time." Hank nodded but didn't look away from the mountains. "You did it," Blackwood continued. "You found my brother and brought him home. The reward money is yours, every penny of it." "Keep it?" "What?" Hank finally looked at him. "Keep the money. Use it to get yourself and Samuel as far away from here as possible. Go back to California, or better yet, go east. Somewhere civilized. Somewhere safe." "What about you?" Hank took another pull from the bottle. "I've got work to do." "What kind of work?" "The kind that's going to get me killed, probably." Hank stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. "That creature up there isn't finished with us, Mr. Blackwood. What happened in that cave was just the beginning. And if Samuel's right about there being others scattered across the frontier, then we've got bigger problems coming than any of us are ready to handle." Blackwood joined him at the porch railing. "What are you going to do?" "What I've always done. Track them. Study them. Try to understand what they want and what they're planning." Hank looked up at the star-filled sky. "And pray to God that when the time comes, I can find a way to stop them." The next morning, Hank Bigfoot Hunter loaded his pack horse with supplies and rode north toward the mountains. Behind him, Silver Creek went about its business of mining and drinking and pretending that monsters didn't exist. Ahead of him, the high country waited with its secrets and its dangers and its ancient intelligences that remembered when the world was young. He had work to do. Important work. The kind of work that only a man called Hank Bigfoot Hunter could accomplish. Because somewhere in those mountains, something was watching. Something was planning. And something was waiting for the right moment to remind humanity that they weren't the only intelligent species on this continent, and they certainly weren't the strongest. The joke had been on everyone who'd laughed at his stories and dismissed his warnings. But now the laughter was over, and the real work was about to begin. Hank Bigfoot Hunter rode into the wilderness alone, carrying his rifles and his determination and his growing certainty that the war between species had already begun. The only question was whether humanity would realize it in time to fight back. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always had. But Hank Bigfoot Hunter was patient, and he was stubborn, and he understood that some hunts take a lifetime to complete. And somewhere in the high country, something that had been waiting for decades smiled with too many teeth and began to plan the next phase of a campaign that had been generations in the making. The real joke was just beginning.